one of the most interesting chapters in world history, and that is confrontation of cultures. How do we think the various cultures got intermingled and the changes that occurred after it? So if we see, we had a lot of sailors moving from the region of Spain and Portugal to the Latin America. Now first of all, understand what is Latin America. So the region of Central America and South America together is known as Latin America. Why it is named so? Because the people who moved from Spain and Portugal had their mother tongue, which was in Latin, and therefore they named this region as Latin America. Most of the settlers in these regions were from Spain and Portugal. Now understanding how this all occurred, firstly, we need to understand that during the 11th to 14th century, the region of Europe was highly prosperous. You had city-states that were being built in the region surrounding Italy, and there was huge accumulation of wealth. However, from mid 14th century to 15th century, what happened was a series of traumatic events. These were spread of diseases, mainly plague, smallpox, breaking down of empires, and because of the revolutions that had come up and the problems due to war, this region suffered. Now, as a result, they were looking for new lands to be discovered. So, there was a order given by the Pope during that time that whosoever might move and locate new regions and new areas would have the right to rule over those areas, and this was one of the motivations for sailors. Now sailors during that time were discovering parts of the world where they could move with further details. So what happened was sailors like Columbus and others started to move from the region of Spain and Portugal. They moved to different parts of the world. The major areas they moved were the parts of North America, the regions of Caribbean, Greater Antilles, the present-day Cuba, what we call as, the regions of Central America, Mexico, and then you had parts of South America. So these were the areas where they actually moved. Now, if we understand this map carefully, there were three important civilizations that were built. One was the Aztec Civilization. This was the part of the present-day Mexico. Next to it was the Mayan civilization, and in the parts of South America we had the Inca civilization. Now all these three civilizations were very interesting, and that's what would be the focus today. How these civilizations had a solid foundation and how with the European advent the scenario changed. And besides this, there were another local tribes that were seen in the regions of Cuba and Greater Antilles. Those were two tribes, those were Arawaks and Caribs. So we would be talking about Aztecs, Mayas, Incas, Arawaks and Caribs in this section. Also, at that point, when European sailors were moving into the lands of the present-day America, the real scenario was that these people were totally untouched. They were unexplored. They were not aware about other lands. And the region in which they were dwelling was dense forest, mainly in the region of South America, Amazon river flowing through with dense forest, and even in the Mexico, the coastal areas, the plain areas had lots and lots of dense growth, and there was most of the tribes that were settled in this region. Now, another important thing was during the time of independence of Americas, it was seen that North America itself had 13 different colonies, and there were various forces that rebelled against it, and finally there was the independence of United States of America, which is the present day USA. So all this makes it really worth and interesting to understand how local communities lived and what was the interaction with the Europeans as it proceeded. The local communities of South America Aztecs, Mayas, Incas, and Arawaks and Caribs. So that would be the focus here. Now understanding first of all about Arawaks. Arawaks were the common people who lived in the region of Greater Antilles, present-day Cuba, which was part of the small island group that you can see which lies between the North America and the South America, between the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea. And in this island region you had two important tribes. One of the tribe was Arawaks and the next tribe was Carib. Now two of the tribes here had very opposite views. Caribs were very furious tribes. They were very ferocious. They used to attack and they did not had a community grouping. However, Arawaks on the other hand were very different. They lived in groups. They collected food in groups. They did hunting, gathering and agriculture, and whatever produce was done was meant for everyone. Also, they were animist. Animist means they do not believe in one single god or any god. They used to worship nature, stones, leaves, anything that was there was worshipped, and therefore we call them as animist. Polygamy was a common practice. Also, the Arawaks, as you can see here, were the tribal groups who moved into the ocean areas through the canoes, and they had the dugout canoes that was there. Most of the people were known for their respect for the clan elders. So clan was the group that they used to live in, reside in, and there was an elder person or the head of the clan, and everyone used to follow the orders that were given by the head of the clan. The next interesting thing was they had ornaments made of gold. But for them, gold was not at all precious. They considered it just like a normal thing that they used. But what happened interestingly was when Europeans came in, Europeans knew the value for gold. They were after gold and silver because there was lot of wealth accumulation in European nations during that time, and they asked Arawaks to exchange glass beads for gold. Arawaks were very excited about these colorful round beads and they quickly were ready to exchange it for gold. However, the value was a huge difference in terms of the glass beads as well as the gold. So that was a very interesting thing that happened. Again, when Europeans were moving, they brought about with them not only the things, the power, but they also brought about diseases. Smallpox was one of the common disease that was brought by the Europeans to this region. And initially the Arawaks, as has been mentioned in the text, never said no. They were very polite. They were very humble. The first time Christopher Columbus reached the island of Greater Antilles, they were the ones who welcomed them, arranged food and accommodation and everything. But later on, over the period of over the time, they realized that they were being terrorized. Their rights were being taken off, their lands was being taken off, and also this disease that was spreading was considered as an invisible bullet to abolish them or to just clear their areas, to clear the people. And this was one of the major issues that Arawaks had. Also, they were known as weavers. They used to weave hammocks, which was very popular. So that was one of the basic characteristics of the tribe Arawaks. As we said, they were generous people, happy to collaborate initially, but later on they had to face harsh consequences of the Spanish policy of expansion, and they were one of the worst affected tribes when it came to the expansionist policies of Spain. However, during the same time, there was another tribe which was Carib. Now, we would talk about this in detail when we would be focusing on Christopher Columbus. But the idea in summary was that when Columbus came for the first time, he was welcomed warmly by Arvax. But by the time he was returning, most of his sailors were homesick, the ships were torn, and there were worms eating the ships. And then again, all on this, there was Caribs. They had to face a fierce, we could say, avenge from Carib, which was one of the most ferocious tribes of the region. So their return journey, in simple words, was not that easy. Now, coming on to the north of America, north of South Americas, there was another interesting tribe or people who were known as Tupinamba. Now, Tupinamba was an interesting group of people. The region of Brazil was known for no gold. So, basically, Europeans were not interested into discovering and taking or extracting something from Brazil because there was no gold. But they soon realized Brazil was known for Brazil wood. Brazil wood was a timber, and that was also red dye, as it was popularly called as. So people from Europe were after timber, and the local tribes were very surprised why they are after timber. This is just wood, and if they are asking for wood, we are ready to cut our forest and give the wood to them. It should not be a big issue. But for them, timber was very precious, and they use that timber for furnitures, for decorations, and so on. Now, this region was, the people of Tupinamba were worst hit. Why? Because they were the common tribal people who had never seen iron in their life. Now, when the Europeans came in, they brought iron, they brought things made up of iron, and these people were very surprised. They considered this to be magical and a marvel. So they were ready to cut down their forest and get some iron knives in exchange. And that was one of the reasons that the forest area of the Brazil started to get cleared, and the timber was then exported to Europe as huge logs moving from the Americas, the region of Southern Americas, to Europe, and that was a simple exchange of iron with the timber. This is similar to Arvaks, who were exchanging gold with glass beads. So that was a very basic idea about the tribes there. Now coming on to three major civilizations, as we said. So in this map, if we move back, we have three important civilizations. I'll mark it here. So this is the Aztecs, this is the Mayas, and this region in the South America, the region of Andes, is the Incas. Three of these major civilizations which were part of the development that we would understand today. Aztecs, first of those. Now Aztecs was a region in the parts of Mexico, and why it was named after the god Mexitli. So after the god Mexitli, the region of Mexico was named, and Aztecs were there, and they had the main city which was known as Tenochtitlan. So Tenochtitlan was one of the main cities of Aztecs. Now what was so unique about this city? This city had chinampas. What were chinampas? Chinampas were nothing but artificial islands. So Aztecs took a huge land of reclamation. They developed artificial islands. How did they develop those? They weaved huge pieces of reed mats, and with these reed mats that they were weaving, they also covered it with mud and planted it. So there was a series of islands that were developed, and in between these islands was canals, and this was the magnificent view of Tenochtitlan, and this was one of the capital centers of Aztec during that time, the main center of power. Now the people of Aztec were known for war. So they worshipped god of war, they worshipped god of sun. That was the basic concept of Aztec civilization. The society was hierarchical. Noblemen, priests, well-read people, talented artists were given a very high position in the society, and traders also enjoyed kind of privileges, but this was a general structure that we understand. Now, when it comes to the rural base of the region, the rural area was known for its crops. What were the main crops? The most important crop was corn, followed by beans, squashes, all kind of vegetables, pumpkin, manioc, tapioca. So those were the common vegetation, common agriculture. Besides that, schooling was very important in Aztec civilization. So for the schooling, the children of the nobilities, the noblemen's children, the king's children, and the common man's children used to go to separate schools. The schools for the nobility was known as Kalmakak, and the school of the common people, which was in the neighborhood itself, was known as Tepuchakali. So those were the two different schooling patterns that were seen. Boys used to get military training and training in agriculture, trade. However, girls were trained in domestic skills. So that was the basic structure of civilization as it evolved. Also, over the time we had seen European invasion to the land, and with the European invasion there were peasants moving in. So you had European serfs coming in, slaves from Africa moving in. So there was a huge change in the social structure as there were invasions from European region into the Aztec civilization. But yes, during that time, this was one of the most established, powerful civilizations where the land was not owned by individuals but by clans. The next was Mayas. Now, Mayas was predominantly in agriculture, lying in the southern parts of Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and present-day Honduras and parts of El Salvador. This was the region where you had a lot of development during 11th to 14th century, but after 14th century, the power of Aztecs grew and Maya's power started to fell down, to decrease. Now, what was the major idea here? This was predominantly an agricultural region. Corn was the most staple crop and it was considered as religious. So planting, growing, harvesting of crop was something that was very significant to the common people in Maya kingdom. Also, all the surplus agriculture was helped for development. During that time, Mayas had developed strong base in mathematics and astronomy. The most interesting thing was their writing style. Their writing style was pictographic, similar to a Chinese writing style, and a large part of it is still undeciphered. Only a few of the scripts of Mayas has been deciphered as of now. So that was about the second important civilization, which was Mayas. Moving on to next was Incas. Now Incas had a huge indigenous civilization along the Andes mountains, and it was also known as Quechas or Incas of Peru. Now, during the 12th century, the first Inca was the Manok Capac, and he established the city of Cusco. Now, this was one of the major capital centers of Inca civilization during that time. Inca was known for its numerous developments. Firstly, this was an area which was not that fertile like the Aztecs and the Mayas. So what they had to do to get agriculture, they had to develop drainage system. So they indigenously developed drainage system, terrace farming, and because of which they were able to bring in agriculture into that area. But they were known for their excellent structures. Machu Picchu is one of the names that you would have commonly heard about. Now, how this was done? This was done by a technology which was known as flaking. So, huge pieces of bricks, stone slabs were brought and they were joined even without mortar. This required a labor-intensive technology, and masons basically shaped these blocks, carved these blocks as single pieces, and this was the technique of flaking. They had a huge organized labor to move huge stone slabs from one region to another, and some of the stone slabs as of now, which we can see even in Machu Picchu, have been weighing more than 100 metric tons. So you can imagine the organization of the labor to help move that 100 metric ton stone slab without any technological advancement or any technological involvement. So labor intensive technology was the key for development of Incas. Now there was a centralization of power. King was the supreme authority, and his empire stretched from Ecuador till Chile, and this was a significant development in the extent of the empire that was seen as contrast to the Aztecs and the Mayas. However, when it comes to the kind of animals that were found, llamas were the common animals that were found. Corn and potato was the common crops that was grown in this region. The population during that time is believed to be millions, and it's surprising that such a huge structure, as we can see even now, the Machu Picchu structure got destroyed, so it could have accommodated a huge set of population. The structure was pyramidal. That means king was the top of the pyramid, and then you had the huge army that was there. So if the king is being affected, there was a series of army that would start the rebel, and this was the way they were able to protect themselves and their empire. Now again, weaving was very important and ritualistic to Incas. The way of accounting system, counting and accounting, we could say, was very unique. This system was known as Quipu. Now Quipu was a simple system where there was a cord, and on that cord or that rod or that thread, you could say, there were knots that were tied, and tying of the knots was the indication of the amount of transaction or any kind of mathematical calculation they would do. So no written numbers, nothing but a simple instrument to do the basics of mathematics, which was known as Quipu. So Quipu was again a very major invention and development that was seen in the Inca civilization. Coming on to the similarities that existed between Incas and Aztecs. Incas and Aztecs were known for their power, the monarchical setup that was there, the society being hierarchical, and there was no private ownership of resources in either case. So all the land was under the clan. There was no private ownership of individual person for the land, and we forgot to mention in the Aztecs, as in the Aztecs, in the Incas, both of the civilizations has shamans. Shamans were the healers who considered themselves to be the link between the world and the supernatural world. And these were ones who considered themselves as priests and who were called for all ritualistic purposes. And gold and silver, similar to the Aztecs, for Incas, it did not had any material value unless and until there was a European invasion. So that was about the basics of the three civilizations: Aztecs, Incas and Mayas. Along with that, we understood the two major tribes, the Caribs and the Arawaks. We understood about the three civilizations that existed in South America and Central America, but during this time, there was European voyages, the European sailors who were moving and trying to discover India. But rather than reaching India, they reached the regions of America. And when they reached the regions of America, their three motives were main. First was an economic motive, to bring back wealth to the regions of Europe, which were already bad hit because of war, because of plague, because of smallpox and all kind of internal unrest that was happening there. The next was political motive. Political motive means, as the Pope said, the new regions that you will discover would be the places where you could have your right to rule. And the third important motive was religious motive, to spread their religion, Christianity, which they considered as a joyous religion. Now, let's focus on these three one by one. So, as we said, the people of South America and Caribbean were naive. They were not aware about the foreign world. However, the magnetic compass was discovered back in 1380s around. The people in South America and Central America got to know about it only once voyages from Europe started, and that was during the 15th century. So, till that time, they were totally unaware. However, Europe during this time was developing its naval power. So, it was building large ships, huge ships that could carry cargo, huge ships that could carry slaves from the regions of Africa to America, and they were also trying to defend their ships from the enemy. Also, they were highly influenced by the literature that was written. So during that time, in 1477, Ptolemy wrote a book which was known as Geography, and this was a simple book that talked about latitudes, longitudes, and the three different continents. Those were Europe, Asia, and Africa. So Europeans started for a sea voyage to discover Asia, but with the wind they moved to some other areas and they reached to the parts of Americas which was undiscovered or unmentioned, was not mentioned in the works of Ptolemy during that time. So this was a new land that they started to discover. And this series of voyages was known as a period of exploration or an age of exploration or voyages of discoveries. It was not that voyages did not happen before the 14th and the 15th century. We have historical traces about Arabs, Chinese, Indians moving in the oceans, crossing vast stretches of oceans. We also have Vikings of Norway who were in expeditions in the 11th century. But besides all this, 14th to 15th century is considered as the age of exploration, discovery of new lands. And during that time, as we said, the European economy weakened. There were crises, there were plague, there were depopulation, shortage of gold and silver, the wealth accumulation which was done during the 11th century when the city-states and Italian empire was built was slowly and gradually dismantling. Also, Italy now had a worse relation with the parts of Turkey, mainly the Constantinople, and there was a war between the two regions, and as a result, Italy now had to pay huge taxes to Turkey, and that was one of the reasons that their empire started to downgrade. Also, besides this, there was crusades. What were crusades? Crusades was nothing but religious wars. So crusades started where Turks began a kind of religious war, and there was a trade relation between the Europe and the Asia that was created based on the taste of products that people in Europe versus people in Asia would require, and this was followed by political supremacies and power for new land, capturing new land. So all this was a series of development that was witnessed during that time. As we saw, Spain and Portugal were known for their sailors and was a region from where you had most of the European sailors that originated. However, it's important to note in history that Spain and Portugal were not the nations who actually benefited from this trade. When they brought back the news, the sailors from Spain and Portugal brought back the news to the regions of Europe. There was the advent for power that started from the regions of Britain, Belgium, Holland, Denmark, and these were the area that actually pressurized them to acquire new land, bring in resources. This could be food crops, this could be gold, silver, or timber as it is. So all this was being pressurized not by Spain and Portugal but by the neighboring European states during that time. And the leaders of the expedition who were moving from one place to another were given titles. So for example, Christopher Columbus, that we would understand in a while, declared himself the viceroy of the region he moved to, and they also had the right to govern on the lands they actually ruled or they moved to. So let's talk about the story of Christopher Columbus. Now, Christopher Columbus was greatly inspired by one of the readings, Imago Mundi, which was the work of astronomy and geography written by Perry Ely, and this was back in 1410. Now, after getting inspired, Columbus started to move out to discover new lands. He requested his Portuguese crown, but Portuguese crown refused. So what he did was he moved to Spanish authority and modestly and humbly asked them for the voyage. The Spanish authorities agreed for the same. So he moved with a very small fleet in 1492. So it was a huge gap between when he was inspired by the reading and when he moved actually. And the fleet consisted of a small now which was known as Santa Maria, along with two caravels which were small light ships which were named as Pinta and Nina. So Santa Marina, you had Santa Marina and Pita and Nina. So these were the three things that moved with him, and they enjoyed their outward journey. The trade winds flew them to different direction, and their path, the map that they were tracing, was lost. Lost in the sense that they lost the direction. The map was with them, but they lost the direction. Now, after 33 days of moving, they were without any sight of anything except the sea and the sky. They could not see anything, no piece of land till far off. The crew was very, very afraid. They got resistive and they were asking Columbus to move back. Columbus at this time sighted the land and he convinced his people to move forward. And when he reached the island of Guanahani in the Bahamas, the present day Bahamas, he called this as India, considering that he discovered India. But it was not India, it was Indies, the West Indies region, the present day West Indies region. Excuse me. And then, as soon as he moved there, he was greeted by Arwaks. Arwaks were, as we discussed, very, very humble people, very generous people. They very warmly welcomed him. They never said no to anything, and he had a good time. During this time, he planted a flag, and this flag in Guanahani in Bahamas, which was later renamed as San Salvador, the present day San Salvador, was the place where they started the prayer service and the local people started gathering, and at that point he proclaimed himself to be the viceroy of the region. So that was the thing that we talked about in the last section. There was a political motive, they acquired the land, and there was a supremacy of power that they were trying to establish, political motive, with considering themselves as the viceroy of the region. The people, as we said, were very naive. They did not ask for anything and they were all happy. However, when they were returning back, they had a fierce movement. Caribs, which was a furious tribe, as we have discussed, ferocious tribe was there. The ships that they were moving in were eaten by worms. The people had been very homesick. His crew members were very tired, and the return voyage took nearly 32 weeks. So it was a huge time for them to move, with lot of hostilities, lot of difficult time they had witnessed. But this did not stop Columbus from further voyages. He completed his exploration in Bahamas, Greater Antilles, and the parts of north of South America in the later voyages. So he did repetitive voyages after that, and this voyage, which was the return journey of which voyage was not a kind of memorable event for him, could not resist him for his further expeditions. Now, if we talk about the present day naming, we can see a small country of Colombia in South America, a Colombia district in North America. However, both of these places have nothing to do with Columbus. Columbus never visited these two places. The whole of the region of Americas, as it has been named today, has been named after Amerigo Vespucci, and he was a geographer from Florence, and he is the one who has been credited to the discovery of the New Worlds. The name America has been first used by a German publisher in 1507. Now, how the Spanish Empire actually grew in America was further interesting. Spanish people brought with them gunpowder and horses. And this was the way to terrorize the common people. The local people were compelled to pay tribute and were compelled to work in gold and silver mines for these Spanish invaders who were moving in. And during the same time, as we said, this was brought about with smallpox spreading into the region. The people of the Caribbeans, mainly the Arawaks, already had low immunity because they did not had exposure to the outside world, and a huge number of Arawaks started to disappear. The other Arawaks considered that there was an invisible bullet that these Spanish people have brought, and that is taking away a huge lot of their community. And this was the smallpox. Now, with this discovery that Columbus did, Spain was now able to explore vast areas of land, and you won't believe most of the areas between 40 degrees north and 40 degrees south was now explored by the Spanish invaders, and they were able to establish their empire and territory over this huge area. So Spain conquered two great empires, the Aztecs, and then you had the Incas, and then there was a huge conflict that was already there, which has been quoted in numerous works. So that was the kind of development that was seen with the invasion of the Europeans in America. Now, the cultures that they brought about were very, very different, and that was one of the reasons why there was a sudden change in the existing civilizational structure that we would see. So, how Aztecs was attacked by Cortex, you have the Cortes, and then you have Picabos in the region of Incas. So, those are some of the stories that we would understand. How Aztec Empire was overthrown is a really interesting story. So what happened was Montezuma was the ruler of Aztec during that time, and there was a local tribe which was known as Totonacs who were trying to acquire power over the Aztecs. Now when Cortes, who was from Europe, basically along with his soldiers who were known as during that time the soldiers of European army were known as conquistadors, moved to this region, and when they were moving they sought help of Totonacs. So what they did was they, along with Totonacs, were trying to capture authorities over Aztec Empire, and Aztec was under the rule of Montezuma. Now if we look onto the map of South America and Central America, the regions of North Mexico was the region where you had the Aztec civilization, as we already know, and these Aztecs were known for their monumental structures. The Tenochtitlan, the city that was built, which was one of the capital cities, which was built as an artificial island and with the canal networks that were there. Now this Montezuma, who was the ruler during that time, was unaware about the destruction that Cortes could bring. Now Cortes, who was moving here, was very, very aggressive, very, very literate person, and he was considered by the people who were aware about the kind of acts that Cortes was doing, that he has been a reincarnation of an exiled god who has returned to avenge himself here, and therefore there was a huge fear and terror in the people. Now when this Cortes moved to the court of Montezuma, the king of Aztec, the king welcomed him warmly. The people were very, very afraid that this should not be done. He is like a big monster entering into the empire of Aztec. And no doubt this was true, because a civilization of Aztec which had more than 1 lakh inhabitants during that time were very, very afraid of the kind of massacre and the cruelty of Cortes. So when Montezuma welcomed him to his court and was welcomed him, gave him a room to live and a place to live, the people were very, very afraid, and they were considering that the end of Aztec civilization has approached. And this was, as we said, no doubt a incorrect thing that happened, because with the welcoming of Cortes, what happened was Montezuma was put in house arrest. So the Aztec ruler was put in house arrest as soon as Cortes moved in. Now, when Cortes basically did a house arrest for Montezuma, he established his power. And as soon as he established his power and declared himself that he would be the ruler of this region, what happened was he received a call back, and immediately he had to move to Cuba for some important assignment that he was asked to do. Now, as a result, this region he gave authority to his deputy officer, who was Alvarado, and Alvarado was assigned the position, and Cortes moved back to Cuba. Now Alvarado had or did a huge massacre at the spring festival of Huitzilopochtli, and this was the festival where a huge massacre was done, and this was protested greatly by the people of Aztec. By the time Cortes returns back to the region of Aztec, he realizes that everything has been shattered, and there was a start of terror that started to develop, and the things were in full blown crisis. People were not able to understand what to do, and there was no other thing but retreat. So retreat of Cortes was the only thing that could be seen during that time. But this was accompanied by some of the mysteries. Montezuma, who was put in house arrest, mysterically died. There were no known reasons of his death. And also, Aztecs had to fight very badly with the forces of Alvarado and Cortes during that time. There were many of the soldiers who lost their life, and this was accompanied by the smallpox that further worsened the scenario, and Aztecs were worstly hit by the smallpox during that time. Now, with just 180 soldiers and 30 horses, Cortes was able to move into the city of Tenochtitlan and prepared for a final stand. And this was the time that Aztecs had declared Quetzalcoatl as the ruler, and the war was a huge battle that was there with just 180 soldiers and 30 horses, and Cutecomoc considered that their end was near. So this conquest was finally done. Aztec civilization no more remained a Aztec civilization. This was wholly under the control of Cortes. Despite of the fact that there were ups and downs that he witnessed, this was a complete victory that was seen, and there was also a night of tears that was considered, and this was an attempt when he was trying to get hold of the region of Aztec again before the election of Quetzalcoatl. So that was a kind of episodical development that happened, and finally the fall of Aztec with Cortes, who became the Captain General of Mexico and who was honored by Charles V from Mexico during that time, and the whole of the power of Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras and Nicaragua was now under Cortes. So this was the way how Aztec civilization was completely destroyed, and Cortes established his supremacy by very fierce, terrifying means, as has been seen with the decline of Aztec civilization. Pizarros and Incas. Now, Incas was one of the major civilizations of South America, as we had known, and it had huge similarities with Aztecs in the Central America. Now, the Incas, which was one of the major civilizations of South America on the region from Ecuador to Chile, was being invaded by Pizarro. Now, Pizarro was an uneducated person. He was not at all in contrast to Cortes, who attacked Aztec, as we have understood in our previous lecture. Now, this person, when he reached there, he saw there was a land of gold and silver. So he simply went back to Spain and showed it to the king of Spain that this is a gold jar that has been prepared by Incas. He was an uneducated, unaware man, so he simply showed it to the king. Now the king promised him that if you are able to conquer that land of Incas, you would be given the governorship of that region and you would have the sole right to rule over there. So since he was not much aware, he thought that what would be the best way to do is what Cortes did. So he tried to replicate the model of Cortes. He thought that he would move into the region of Aztec and bring the king into house arrest and finally have an empire that would be established. But when Pizarro went to Incas, the scenario was totally different. Atahualpa was the one who was who was on throne after the civil wars, and Pizarro when arrived to the scene and captured the king after setting a trap for him. Now, when there was a trap that was made for the king had no other option but to give him some kind of a feeling that a lure for gold. So what he did was, the king said to Pizarro that I'll give you a room full of gold, you just leave me free. But this was also considered as one of the biggest promises that could be given to a person, a kind of extravagant ransom that could be given to a person in order to get himself free. But Pizarro did not stop. He finally executed the king, and all his looters basically looted the region of Incas. Along with this, there was widespread deaths, huge amount of wars that were witnessed, and Atahualpa was finally executed. As soon as this was over, in next 5 years, Spain located huge amount of silver deposits, silver mines in Potosi. Potosi lies in the upper Peru region and the present day modern Bolivia as well. Now, this was the area where huge amount of silver was discovered, and the people of Incas were forced to work on that land or that mining site. When they refused, there were slaves, people from Africa were brought in as slaves to work on these areas, and in most of the cases, the local people of Incas were made slaves to work in these regions. So that is the story about how Incas was invaded by Pizarro, and that brought a revolutionary change in the ground realities that the Incas had, despite of the fact of the pyramidal structure in the Incas, as we had seen, where king was on the top and the whole hierarchy existed to safeguard the empire. There was a severe blow when Pizarro along with his army attacked the region of Incas. Carbels in Brazil. So this was an invasion similar to the Cortes in Aztecs and Pizarro in Incas. So what happened? Brazil was mainly an dense forest area with Amazon river flowing in, and Portuguese basically moved to this region, and this Portuguese the ships that were moving to this region were headed by Cabral. Now Cabral was one of the leading persons of the ships that came in. These Portuguese were trying to discover India, but on the way again their ships got diverted due to the trade winds and they reached the region of Brazil. So they landed onto the land of Brazil. Now Cabral, when he landed here, he discovered Brazil wood. They were not interested in Brazil because it did not have any gold, but they soon realized that here there is something unique, which is Brazil wood, which is a timber that could be used, and this was also called as red dye. So what they did was they started to ask the tribes to cut the trees in exchange of the iron swords, which they considered as magics and marvels. So what they did was they employed a huge number of people in cutting the forest areas and taking the timber logs to Europe. And slowly and gradually, Portuguese were trying to establish that power. Now, soon, France got an information about it. So, there were French sailors who moved into this region. Portuguese sailors and French sailors had a huge clash. And finally, Portuguese were able to settle, not the French. And the king of Portugal divided the coast of Brazil into 14 different hierarchies or 14 different captaincies that he called as, and the people of Portuguese started to live there, started to establish there. When they started to establish there, they tried to create an atmosphere similar to what they had in Europe. So they did not like the dense forest areas, and they started to ask the local people to clear the land. Once they cleared the land, they believed that this is a lot hot and humid region, so it is fit for any kind of sugarcane plantation. So they started sugarcane plantation. Initially, the tribes of Brazil were asked to work on the sugarcane plantations, but the work required very hectic jobs and difficult tasks, which these local people of Brazil were not interested to do, and they were basically captivated to work as slaves in the sugarcane plantations. So many of them just fled away in the dark into the deep forest areas of Amazon rainforest in order to get rescued from this issue. Now, the people who were able to establish this thought that since they have established the plantation, they do require labor. So what they did was they started to bring in slaves from Africa, and this was the way they started to bring in lots and lots of slaves from West Africa. Along with this, in 1549 there was a formal government that was established by Portuguese, and the capital was in Salvador. Also, there was Jesus that were basically started to grow out of Brazil, that is spreading Christianity and spreading a message that Christianity is a joyous religion. But at the same time, they were criticizing the process of slavery that occurred in the region. However, there have been no exact details about the fact that at the front they were criticizing slavery, at the other end the slaves were constantly being brought. So there have been controversies on those issues as well. But this was the story of Brazil, and how Cabral developed power, developed plantation, and timber was one of the major things that was exported from Brazil. Despite the fact that Brazil was a land of no gold, you had a discovery of new concept, that was timber, which was moving out in logs from Brazil to Europe, and the people of Brazil were surprised, and they were asking why you are taking pieces of log from one place to another. You could have certain logs there itself. And they said that it's not for us, it's for our generations. So that was the kind of mental setup that was seen in European invasions, or the European sailors voyages that came up with. So what were the developments with these discoveries? Now definitely Europe was invasion, the Europe's motive were three, as we have discussed: economic, political and religious motive. The idea was to bring in more gold and silver from the regions of South America and Central America to Europe, and again introduction of new crops. As we had discussed previously, the idea was Spain and Portugal were not after the things, but they were being pressurized by countries like Belgium, Holland, Britain, France to take advantage of the discoveries, and created joint stock companies, traded with them, and asked them to develop and expedite their trading missions. There were new crops that were being brought to Europe. Europe was not known for tobacco, potato, cane sugar, cacao, rubber. So these were chilies, potatoes. So these were the crops that were brought from the regions of South America and Central America to the regions of Europe. Now there were serious changes in the types of economic motives that were there. If we talk about the population, the region of Mexico before the conquest had around a population of 30 to 35 million. After the conquest, there was a double population which was around 70 million. But so nearly a huge lot of Europeans, we would say in millions, Europeans arrived to this region. But a century later, the population was only 3.5 million. A huge number of population was lost in wars, lost in the smallpox that is spread, and also there were local people being terrorized. Now they were terrorized psychologically, they were terrorized physically, and as we had seen the Cortes and Pizarro's invasion in the regions of Aztec and Incas, the local people were very terrified, and there was also introduction of forced labor and slavery. As we have seen in Brazil with Cabral moving to power, sugarcane plantations were established. In Incas, there were silver mines that were established, and the local people were forced to work on those regions. Also, full freedom was not given to the local people. There was change of religion that was asked for most of the people to be done, and all of these things basically created a wave of enslavement for the common people. The way of life significantly changed because the common people who were forest dwellers, who were natives in the forest areas, were tribes, were happy with the produce that they had in the nature. So hunting, gathering, agriculture was the mainstay of their life. But with the advent of European invasion, it was seen that economic activities started to boom. So forests were cleared, plantations were developed, minings was developed, and all this was motivated with an idea of movement for gold. So there was lots and lots of slaves that were imported into Brazil. More than 3.5 lakh slaves were brought from Africa in small ships in very worse conditions to the regions of Brazil for the purpose of working in the plantation farms. Also, there has been, as we said, huge debates about abolishing slavery, but that existed prior to the entry of Europeans. Even after the entry of Europeans, they publicly, Philip II of Spain publicly said that slavery is bad, forced labor should not be done, and exploitation of any kind should be curbed immediately. But from the back door, the things went on working. So those was the kind of situation that actually existed during that time. And since the local people were trying to move out of the power and the supremacy of European invasion, they tried to move back into the few remaining jungles and the forest areas in order to protect themselves, and therefore they had to bring in slaves from the region of Africa. So in this section, we have basically understood how different cultures intermingled and how the local civilization were affected by the impact from the foreign culture that was witnessed, how Aztec, Maya and Incas, which was one of the best established civilizations of Central and South America, fought in terms of power, and European invasion gained victory for the lure of gold, silver, mining and plantations that could be done in this region. We would be covering many more interesting lectures in history, the NCERT 11th and 12th. Stay tuned. Have a wonderful day ahead.